In this lesson, we're taking a look at an overview of the nervous system, and here are your lesson objectives. Anatomically, the nervous system has classically been divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system consists of everything else. The peripheral nervous system further gets divided into afferent neurons. These are sensory neurons that are carrying information into the brain and the spinal cord from either the body or outside the body. And efferent neurons, these are response neurons that are carrying signals from the brain and the spinal cord out towards muscles and glands. So classically, the nervous system has been divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but more recently, a third division has been added. That's the enteric nervous system, which controls the gut. And it can actually integrate and send signals all on its own without the central or the peripheral nervous system. And it's actually also sometimes called the second brain because it has so many neurons. Coming back to the central and peripheral nervous systems, if we think about a stimulus in the environment, it's going to be picked up by a receptor and sent along a sensory or afferent neuron into the central nervous system, the brain or the spinal cord, which will integrate that information and then send a response along an efferent neuron. That response can trigger a variety of different things depending on the kind of efferent neuron it goes along. So the efferent neurons are further divided into two basic types. One is the somatic motor neurons. They're going to go to skeletal muscle, and they're involved in controlling voluntary muscle responses. So something like moving your arm or your leg, that response is carried on somatic motor neurons. That's a voluntary response. But there's a whole other division of involuntary responses carried on the autonomic nervous system. So these are involuntary. And these can be either muscle responses or they can be secretions from glands that are triggered. And the autonomic nervous system is further divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. This sympathetic nervous system is often called the fight or flight system. So if you encounter a dangerous stimulus, a bear in the environment, for example, a bunch of things are going to happen. Your pupils are going to dilate, your heart rate is going to go up, your respiratory rate is going to go up, your muscles are going to get flooded with blood. All of those responses are to allow you to either fight the danger or flee. So the sympathetic autonomic nervous system is coordinating fight or flight responses. In contrast, the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system is doing the opposite. It's often called the rest and digest system, and it's going to do the opposite of the things that we just mentioned for the sympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate's going to go down, your respiratory rate is going to go down, etc. So that's an overview of the anatomical arrangement and some of the function of the nervous system. Let's now take a look at a nerve. So this is a nerve in cross-section, and what you can see here are multiple axons. So each of these is an axon of a neuron, and those might be wrapped in myelin, that insulating sheath that speeds up the conduction, or they might not have myelin. So I've put here plus or minus myelin. And you can see here that there are blood vessels as well, and it's wrapped in some protective tissue. So that is a cross-section of a nerve, and any one nerve can either have only sensory signals going from the outside into the central nervous system. It can have only motor responses or effector responses going in the other direction, or some nerves have both. So that's going to depend on the particular nerve that we're talking about. Now let's look a little bit at how motor control happens, or how muscle responses are triggered. Now, skeletal muscles, muscles that are attached to the skeleton, are under voluntary control, and those are also called striated muscles. Striated means striped, and if you look at skeletal voluntary muscles under the microscope, they look striped. And we will see in a later lesson why that is. So striated or skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, and motor neurons are the name of the effector neurons that stimulate them to contract. And here's a look at the overall pathway. The primary motor cortex is a region in the brain where that signal to contract a muscle, to move a muscle, is initiated. And then it travels along a motor neuron that projects from the motor cortex down through the brainstem, that's this region here, and the spinal cord, This is a cross-section of the spinal cord. The white matter on the outside here is mostly myelinated axons, which are fatty, which makes this white, and this gray matter on the inside here are cell bodies, which look darker. So if you hear about white matter and gray matter, it's talking about axons and cell bodies. And white matter and gray matter like that exist in the brain as well. So the signal travels down from the primary motor cortex along this neuron, and then you can see here that it synapses on another neuron that then goes to the muscle, and that triggers the muscle to contract. Now, interestingly, up here in the brainstem, in the medulla specifically, the signal crosses over from one side to the other. So a signal that starts on the left side crosses over to the right side of the body here. In other words, the left side of the brain controls the muscles on the right side of the body. And that's why if someone has a stroke, which interrupts the blood supply to the left side of their brain, then they will often have right-sided paralysis or trouble moving the muscles on the right side of their body. Just one more thing to notice here. Although the signal is going from the primary motor cortex and down, there's this other region here at the back of the brain which looks quite anatomically different, and this is called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is not involved in the main part of the muscle signaling, or the motor signaling, but it is involved in coordination. So if you have damage to your cerebellum, you'll have difficulty with fine motor control and overall coordination. So that's motor control originating in the brain when it is voluntary. Now let's also look briefly at a reflex arc. This is an example of a simple circuit in the nervous system that doesn't need voluntary input. So let's say you accidentally touch the element on the stove. That pain signal comes in on an afferent neuron, synapses in the spinal cord, and then the motor response, the signal to jerk your hand away, travels out on an efferent neuron and pulls your hand away from the damaging stimulus. So this is integrated in the spinal cord, doesn't actually have to go up into the brain, and that makes it much faster. As well, this process is involuntary. So you don't need to think about this, and in fact, by the time you've even felt the pain, by the time the pain signal has traveled up to your brain, your hand is already well away from the hot stove. Just one more note, we've described afferent neurons coming into the central nervous system and efferent neurons carrying signals out from the central nervous system. This neuron in here, which is entirely within the central nervous system and is connecting an afferent and an efferent neuron, is called an interneuron. Some reflex arcs will have interneurons, and so might look like this, and some of them won't, and they'll just have an afferent neuron connected to an efferent neuron. An interneuron, interestingly, can also cross over to the other side, and that gives the ability to have more complex pathways, where one incoming signal triggers responses on both sides of the body. For example, imagine that you touched something hot with your foot. You'd want to be able to withdraw your foot on the same side really quickly, but you'd also want to be able to stick your foot on the other side out so that you maintained the ability to keep standing. So that's a look at an overview of the structure and organization of the nervous system, as well as motor control and an introduction to reflex arcs.